everyone. Very good afternoon. Welcome to the third webinar of Pitch Camp, Sales for Entrepreneur series. Today we have Konark Singhal with us, who is the founder CEO of Mount Blue Technologies. Before I do a quick introduction on him, let me spend just about a minute on Pitch Camp. Pitch Camp is an initiative where we help founders and sales teams help them to pitch and sell better through coaching, consulting, and training activities, right? So we are focusing on SaaS and B2B sales organizations, and that's the ecosystem that we want to champion because we believe sales is a critical skills for entrepreneurs, for them to grow their businesses and thereby help, the economy and the nation as a whole, right? So with that, I'd like to welcome Konark. Konark has been a serial entrepreneur, for the last 8 years. Mount Blue Technologies is his current venture, and he's been running it for last close to 3 years. And he's had an amazing acquisition path, which was what got me excited to get his story onto our platform, where he's acquired more than 150 fast-growing internet startups like Zomato, Yulu, ClearTax, InstaMojo, and so on. So, with this, welcome Konark, welcome to Pitch Camp.
Thank you.
And, very excited to have you here and, get your story out there. So, why don't you give us a quick background of your, journey of being a serial entrepreneur, one venture after the other, and talk a little bit of how Mount Blue got started, and and share little more details on what do you mean as ingenious factory.
Sure.
And that will set the ball rolling.
Sure. So yeah, standard educational kind of journey, engineering, MBA, and then I went and worked for a consulting firm post MBA, and it became very evident very quickly to me in about like a year that consulting is not what I want to do in my life. I want to be much closer to action. And hence, I actually joined an early stage startup called MapMyIndia in 2009. This is 2009, right? This is like 11 years back. This was way before it was cool to quit cushy consulting jobs to go and join early stage startups.
Right.
So when I joined MapMyIndia, I think their sales was probably 6 crores or something that just raised a Series B. It was a 9 million Series B. Of course, that time Series B used to be like 7, 8, 9 million. Nowadays you have Series A, which are double or triple that size. And so Nexus and Qualcomm and Kleiner Perkins and etc. and Lightbox had just come in the company. So I joined them and I ran licensing. I ran B2B sales, a large part of B2B sales, not the B2G sales, but a large part of B2B sales. Right, and that really enjoyed that role. I was fairly young that time. When I started running B2B sales there, I was probably 27, yeah, with very little like real world experience, and that too in consulting, where really your business card gets you into CEO rooms, while in sales your business card means nothing. You can be sitting at the reception for a long time. In fact, I remember my first experience in MapMyIndia was absolutely morale shattering. So I used to work at Bain, and Bain is one of the top consulting firms in the world. And we were accustomed to just walking into CEO rooms when we used to go and meet them. And I remember my first sales call in MapMyIndia was for Z Entertainment. And I was meeting this, I think, really junior person in the finance department there, probably the finance executive there. And I went and probably drove 35, 40 kilometers to go and meet him at 10 a.m. And he kept me waiting until 3 p.m. and didn't meet me.
Oh, okay.
Right. So that was absolutely morale shattering. But anyway, so I worked with MapMyIndia for a while. While I was there, I think the revenue would have grown 10x in about 2.5 years. We raised our next round, which was more a strategic round from a company called Zenrin, which is Japan's biggest map company. So I also played a key role in that, and in that pitch, etc. And then after that happened, I had tried to become a little bit more confident about my capabilities to strike out independently. And so after Zenrin investment, some of my ESOPs got encashed. And so I quit my job and then I started to do things on my own. So I ran the first startup I ran was called SourceWeb. It was essentially SRM on the cloud, supplier relationship management on the cloud. Something similar to Ariba, if you could think Ariba on the cloud, I think it was way too early. We absolutely did not make any headway. We just could sell to one customer, Samsung. It was a fairly big account, but by the then standard 50 lakh rupee account a year. But it became clear quite quickly that it was not becoming the kind of a fast growing SaaS product play that I wanted it to be. And it was becoming more of a services play, much more like a mini Infosys, a mini software
Right.
services
Right.
play. That wasn't particularly interesting at that point of time. So we ultimately ended up finding a buyer for it, a company called Ziva, XEEVA. It's an American company. They're in the same space. They came and acquired us for a very small sum.
Okay.
And then I started off, done with B2B and having kind of faced failure there, I thought, why not go to B2C? So I
Okay.
made my second mistake, which is when I started Mockbank, which was a edtech company. Essentially, again, this is EdTech way before EdTech was cool. This is 2013. Right? EdTech that time was basically a mortuary
Right.
filled, filled with large and small corpses. Right? A lot of people had raised a whole bunch of money from a lot of people, and no one had really succeeded at all.
Correct.
Merit Nation was the biggest EdTech company, and they didn't quite do that well, and they were backed by InfoEdge, right? The biggest internet group in the country then. So anyway, so we ended up raising some venture money in Mockbank from a venture fund called Bloom Ventures, and so we raised about kind of half a million US. And so we
Okay.
kind of ran with it for a while, and it became clear that EdTech was just wasn't happening, and we just couldn't make much headway. And so kind of that company also got sold to to a to a to a to Imbibe, which is a Reliance Group company.
Oh, okay.
Um, yeah. Again, nothing much got made there.
Sure.
These are really what I call face savers for the entrepreneur, right?
Right. Right.
When you start to fail, you hope someone comes and buys you, uh, because you're just too embarrassed to just shut it down, right? And we got lucky that way. That both the times I could find buyers. In the
So
first
this
time,
is where, so post this EdTech venture is when Mount Blue happened.
Correct. And actually, a lot of inspiration for Mount Blue actually came from the RegTech venture. It used to be called Mockbank. So we were essentially a test prep platform for public sector jobs. So think of it as very simply Sarkari Naukri coaching online, right?
Right.
And so we had lakhs of users, and very high percentage of them were engineers. A very high percent of them were actually software engineers, ITIS, computer science engineers, and many of them were fairly smart. And even at that point of time, a smart entry-level engineer could command salaries of 50, 60,000 rupees, and and going ahead, command very high salaries. And the software boom had started, the startup boom had started, and it was quite a conundrum for me to understand why is it that these people are actually even happy taking a clerk job or even sometimes lower level jobs in the government,
Okay.
as opposed to actually try to build a career as a software engineer. So
Okay.
I would have done about 100 calls with our customers to understand what's happening. And what I figured is that most of these people had not picked up any skill in the college. So, I don't want to blame the college, but they had become engineers in the sense that they had degrees, but they had no skills whatsoever. And now there was a lot of anxiety about what will we do if we even take up a software job, what will we do? So they wanted to wipe the state slate clean by going and doing an aptitude test. All the government entrance exams are nothing but CAT-like exams, like aptitude
Okay.
exams. So everyone was kind of going back and saying, okay, we want to kind of whitewash our past and take an aptitude test and figure out a way to get into a government job, which will give us a lifetime of prosperity and stability and pension and whatnot, right? So then, I figured that there is an opportunity there because on the one hand, I was myself a tech company CEO, and I could not find people to hire for my tech team. On the
Okay.
other hand, there were thousands and lakhs of software engineers. Some of them are very smart because we actually had access to their aptitude scores, right? So we could see that some of them were quite smart who could become very good software engineers. But then they were not looking to like build up, become software engineers. So I thought there's an opportunity here to kind of bridge at least part of this gap and build some value for both the software engineer and the employer and capture
Okay.
some of it value for myself. And this looked like a good business idea. So when I when Mockbank got sold to Imbibe, I actually did not go with Mockbank. The rest of the team, or a large part of the team, anyway had to be let go because we were not doing that well. A large part of the team went to Imbibe, but I actually did not go to Imbibe, and I
Sure.
started Mount Blue. Now Imbibe is actually one of our customers. I started Mount Blue, and so the idea was that can we actually take you know the best of the rest, right? So the best of the people who have not gotten great jobs from campus for
Okay.
whatever reason, and do intense 3 month interventions with them, meaning we run 3 months in intense boot camps for them, and then can we actually make them good enough to work in high growth startups, right? So
Okay.
this is basically how Mount Blue started. So this is
And this is what you call as the engineer's factory, right?
correct.
That you
Actually, almost
that
to the date we have been for 3 years. I remember 21st of May is when the first day of our company, the founders actually even met for the first time, and that too in Zoho University. So the model that time, which was very prevalent and very well known, that used to do this was Zoho University, which is nothing but Zoho used to kind of hire 12th pass or sometimes even 12th fail people and pressure train them and then put them in Zoho product teams. So
right.
this was a well-known thing. So I reached out to Rajen Dandapani, who runs Zoho University, and he's one of the founders of Zoho. And he was very nice, and he accorded all courtesies to us. He actually invited us all to Zoho University. So 21st of May, first time all the founders met at Zoho University, exactly 3 years from now. And so
And
yeah,
at
so
this time, fantastic. This is great. You know, insights into why you got this started and how you saw this as an opportunity. So when you actually started to put set this all in motion together, right? This is a new concept, right? Where you had a lot of independent training schools, but who never had a commitment based outcome, to help get them acquire, get hired by these organizations, fast internet growing startups. And you started this right at the time where the velocity of these startups were growing, right? So how did your initial customers react to this value proposition that you were giving? What are the kind of objections that you handled? That came up because this is they don't have a template except for a normal hiring process that they would do. So walk us through that experience on your initial customer acquisitions.
So one advantage that I had is that I had actually been in the startup world for 6, 7 years by then. So I had, and I'm generally someone who kind of, meets people and keeps in touch, and I generally have had somehow over the years built a small network of founders. So when I started this company, even before I started this company, in April 2017, which is when I was doing prep work, I just went and met a bunch of these founders and their CTOs. And I told them, this is what I want to do. Do you guys think you will be interested in trying these people out? And so, I mean, I would have met probably 15 such companies. And I think everyone, bar none, said that, what you're saying sounds interesting. We don't think it will work because we don't think that you can actually find such people where with a 3 month intervention you can make them good enough for my company, because we only
Right.
have from IITs and IITs, triple ITs, all that.
Correct.
Every company has a standard kind of thing that they give you. But you know what? If you do it, we will want to take a try. What the hell? Because we are anyway struggling to hire, right? And so this
Okay.
is the time. I mean, it's been a big pain. If there are entrepreneurs on the call, they know that it's a big pain to hire smart software engineers. And I knew it anyway firsthand because I was myself a software entrepreneur. So I figured that the only way to really test this hypothesis out is to just go and do it, right? And then let's see if it goes. So I went ahead and kind of did this, and then I went back to these people, and I said, okay, so guys, I've done that. So why don't I take you up on an offer? And people were very happy to actually try it. So our first cohort of 10, we had 14 people. We graduated 10 people. Uh, between three companies, all the 10 got absorbed within 2 days of me giving them a call saying that I'm ready. And
Okay.
then those people did really well. And then after that, it's just been a series of references and just good word of mouth really. So actually, I don't do much sales. It's a little funny that I'm doing this call because I actually don't do much sales. It's really my sales effort is attending to incoming calls.
Okay.
because we get a lot of very good word of mouth going. We're focused on building a really good product, right? And when you go and give a good product to your to founders, founders have friends who are founders, right? They meet other founders and they share problems and they share solutions,
Right.
and that's how we got evangelized,
Okay.
right?
So you
You
basically, yeah.
we got an incoming call even from Microsoft, right? And now Microsoft is also a customer of ours.
Oh, okay. Fantastic.
Yeah.
So how did so you're a strong believer that that the first salesperson in the team has to be a founder. So walk me through that mindset as to why you very strongly believe that before you hire a sales guy, the founder themselves have to transform into the first salesperson on the team.
So of course I'm talking about B2B here. I think that's quite
Right.
clear, right? So look, so when you start a new company, right? So you start with a place of absolute zero credibility for that startup, right? You have a new product, no one knows about it. Your company name, no one knows about. You probably do not have an office, right? There's been no press about you in most cases, right? And when you start going and talking to people, they've never heard about a company, right? So the company has zero credibility, but you as an individual hopefully has some credibility, right?
Right.
And credibility could come from you know which college you went to, which companies you worked at before this, who knows you, right? If you get a warm introduction, that adds to credibility. So at the start, when the company has zero credibility, the founder has to actually almost make their own credibility the proxy of the company credibility. So you go, when I went and met my first customer, I didn't go as Mount Blue, I went as Konak, right? Konak, the guy who went to XYZ college for engineering and XYZ college for MBA and then worked at ABC company, and the guy who knows 10 of your friends and who have referred Konak to you. So then I go with some credibility, right? And then you put that on the line. Think about it from the guy who is buying, right? So they want to make sure that this doesn't go south. They are worried whether you will be around tomorrow or not. When
Right.
a founder, when you go and tell that, what, this is what I am, this is what I can do, this is what I have done in my life, this is my opportunity cost, right? I could be in a say 70 lakh rupee job if I was not doing the startup, but I'm doing this because I really believe in it, right? Then you actually in a way give an incentive to the buyer to consider you seriously. But when a VP of sales goes, he has just joined this company, right? He has no loyalty to the company. He could walk away tomorrow. If something goes south, who is the buyer going to catch,
Right.
right? So when you're buying, and especially when professionals are buying, when a founder is buying, the founder is probably much more perceptive and they can try to figure these things out by themselves. But when you're selling to someone who is not a founder, one of the most important things for them to do is to save their own job. So, no
Right.
one got, as the saying goes, no one got fired for buying from IBM, right? So
Right.
while, just choose IBM, you will not get fired even if IBM screws up. So you need to be able to convince that non-founder buyer that, what, we will not screw up because I'm a quality guy. And you know it because I went to a quality college, I went to quality companies and quality people that have referred me to you. And they have in a way put their credibility on the line, right? So I think the founder has to. That's one reason. The second reason, and I think a very important reason is when you start to sell, your product is still evolving, right? You don't have really a product. You have a general idea of what you're trying to sell to whom and for what problem. So when you go and talk to customers, you can actually start to understand. It starts to inform your product thesis very significantly, and you
Okay.
can then take that learning back, and you can actually either if you are also a product founder, incorporate it, or talk to your product co-founder and tell them, or if you don't have a product co-founder, you can talk to your product VP and tell them. But if your sales VP goes, he only knows how to sell, right? If a sales VP goes and
Right.
comes back and tells, what, I wanted to make a change in this product, then I'm like, dude, I asked you to sell, you've gone and bought. They have sold you,
Correct.
right? You were to go to sell to them, but you have actually bought and come back, right? So I think this is also one of the reasons why a founder should sell the first few sales because you are still nailing down the value proposition, the 4 P's, right? What the product should be, what should the pricing be, how do I appeal to this guy? Is there a channel through which I go,
Right.
right? Whole product marketing mix is actually being still developed. And if the founder is not going to be involved in developing the sales and developing the product marketing fit, then what is the founder doing anyway?
True. True. Fantastic. So the way you have built your initial set of customers was primarily through your networks and through references, right? So now on one side you have limited capacity to fulfill demand, and through your initial customers, you started seeing demand to go higher as well. So now, how did you solve to manage higher demand to higher supply, and then scale your customer acquisition? Because acquiring your initial 7-10 would have come through references, I mean, come through your private network. But then scaling from 10 to 150, you must have done something, right, on this acquisition strategy, and also trying to solve your supply side, which is your graduates. So talk us through something
Sure.
on these lines.
So in terms of reaching out to more number of customers, really the thing that I focused on was letting a lot of people I already knew know that I'm doing this. Not
Okay.
explicitly as sale, but letting it be known far and wide that I'm doing this, right? And the other thing that we did, which is not really sales strategy, but really helped in sales, is that we did a really good job in delivering our promise. So we did not overpromise, first of all, right? We always over-delivered on our promise. So what that did is that it did generate a very strong word of mouth, which is people just referring their friends, and people moving from one company to the other, and then getting that company to work with you, and people referring to their friends, and and their customers and their vendors. So most of our sales actually come through this. So we haven't done a lot of you know cool nifty marketing. There are some small hacky things that I do. So for example, I have this one page about our company, which is like just a one page which I like print on a like nice sheet of paper and carry a whole
Right.
bunch. Yeah, you
Yeah, I
know that, right?
remember that. The first time
Yeah.
we met, you shared that
Yeah,
poster.
everyone who meets me gets a copy of that. And so it's a nice glossy paper. It's shiny. It has a lot of logos. So it has almost all the company logos that we work with, right? So I give it to people when I meet them, and they keep it, and it attracts attention. So it keeps lying on their table, and whoever when someone else passes by, they look at the page. It's also a choice of colors that you have there. Right, I can
Right.
actually probably even share my screen to show that page if you want. Cool. Yeah, so this is basically just one page about us, right? And I kind of, and Bimlesh has seen this anyway. So you can see it's a fluorescent color. You can't miss this if it's lying on a table, printed on a matte paper, right? So and I have 100 of this in my bag all the time. So whenever I meet a new customer, and if I go and meet 10 people there in that company, I give one copy to each of them, and then they keep it on their desk, and then the whole company comes to know, and then their friends come to know. So these are some of the small hacky things that I do.
This is like the medical rep hack, right? So every time the
Yeah,
medical
yeah,
rep goes around to the doctors, there's always something
yeah.
that he gives away to the doctors. Fantastic.
Correct. Yeah. The other thing that I do actually, I like to meet my customers face to face. It's a funny time to be saying this, but I like to meet my customers face to face. And what I also like to do is once I've met them in the office, I try to now meet them not in the office. So I like to meet them outside the office. That's when people have their guard down and people really connect to you at a personal level. So
Right.
essentially, these things end up. So the broad strategy here is I like to make friends with my customers, right? So I want them to think of me as a well-wisher and a friend, and I behave that way and I act that way, and that starts by delivering on the promise, but even other things. So for example, if I met you a couple of times in the office, the third time when I come to meet you, I'll actually take you out for lunch or drinks. And then I start to connect you at a personal level, right? I start to understand about a family, about your aspirations, what are the other things you want to do, and then once you start becoming their friend, then they start connecting you to their other friends. Then they start calling you to their kids' birthday parties, right? And their
Right.
housewarming functions, right? Yeah. Right. So so
True.
the other thing that I do is I read a lot. So I have a fairly strong reading habit. Um, I read a whole bunch of varied things from politics to sports to just startup business health stuff. And I pass on the relevant material to my friends, which includes my customers. So if I read a nice if I consume a nice Andreessen Horowitz podcast about some investment app for kids, let's say, I'll send that podcast to my customers at Walrus Pay, which are building a kind of kids investment app,
Got
and
it.
with a recommendation note. Or if I kind of come across a good podcast on Yelp, I'll send that to Dipinder in Zopna in Zomato with a note, right?
Okay.
Dipinder is also a customer, right? So I do that, and then I start to position myself as not someone who talks to them only for business. In
Correct.
fact, I hardly ever talk to them for business. I just talk to them generally as friends, right? So if you remember, we got in touch because I came to sell to you, right?
Right.
And I've never sold to you after that, right?
Right.
But we have kept in touch, right? So and then when they want people, then they automatically come to. When they want your services, they automatically come to you,
Right.
right? Because
So
you start to position yourself as their genuine well-wisher, and not as someone
right.
who's only interested in their check.
Interesting. So this is a great strategy. Once I rightly agree with you, right? Once you position yourself above and beyond the normal line of expectation, much
Yeah,
more easier becomes a conversation when you're trying to close a sale, close a contract, or even putting out a price out there confidently, which may or may not be in line with the market norms, right? So so leading to this question, right? So hiring on contract and contract to hire is a very commoditized market in the minds of people, right? So now
yeah,
you are trying to position your factory that is going to produce quality output people who are ready to be productive from day one. And at any point of time, since they are on contract, I'm sure you have some segues pegged into it, that replacements are provided, etc., right? So but from a from a pricing point of view, what kind of challenges you faced? Did you go through uh, fighting against the market price? You priced high, you priced low. Talk us through some of your pricing approaches with respect to now this elevated positioning of mindshare that you had.
sure. So our price, at least I have always thought that our price is actually extremely competitive. Uh, I mean, I have always thought that, but not all customers, of course, think that. We were lucky that our first few customers were absolutely convinced that the price they were getting was absolutely a steal, right? So that helped.
Okay.
So because by the time I started getting pushback on price, and whatever, even if you price yourself at zero, you will get pushback on price. Even if you price yourself at zero, people say you should be paying me money to for me to be using this, right? So you will always get pushback on price. So I got lucky because my first 10, 12 customers had absolutely zero pushback on price, right? So by that time I could kind of establish the price, and I was very confident in the price being correct, right? But I think ultimately you get pushed on price, you will get pushed on price, but the way to tackle this is actually not the pricing strategy at all. Ultimately, the way to tackle is to find clear differentiations in your product, right? So I'll tell you, people do not buy just purely based on price,
Right.
especially if you're selling to startups. You mostly selling to founders, and a lot of what I'm telling you is selling to founders, right? So it may be different. Selling to enterprise may be different. I don't have a lot of experience there, and whatever experience I have is from long back at MapMyIndia,
Sure.
almost 10 years.
Sure.
But the founder is a very perceptive beast, right? They are a very perceptive beast, and so they don't decide based on price. So they first decide who they want to work with, and then they try to drive down the price for that thing. And they will say all sort of things that I'm talking to XYZ, and you know what, I'm getting it cheaper, and that you are ripping me off, or whatever they say. If they are talking to you about buying a product, they have already decided to buy you. This is true in an overwhelming majority of cases.
Okay.
So you are already halfway there, right? Now, all you need to do is to kind of pander to the ego of the founder and find a way to kind of for them to think that they did get a victory out of you, right, in a
Right.
negotiation, because they're all very competitive people. But really, if they're talking to you multiple times about price, that means they've decided to buy you, and which is also a signal that you do not need to change your price significantly if you yourself believe your price is right. If
Correct.
you don't yourself know the right price, then of course there is merit in kind of doing 2 3 deals at whatever price you get to understand what price will work, right? In my case, it was easy because we almost have a cost plus approach, right? And the cost clearly is clearly known. It's not a value based approach. It's a cost plus approach. The cost is clearly known, so we priced it that way, and that I think we kind of got a little lucky, and we probably were also a little smart about that, and so our price has kind of worked quite well. But 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 I don't think the way to close these deals is by being very flexible on price. It's by building in features in either your product or value proposition, right? So in my case, the product was that these are very well trained people, but this is such a commoditized line. These are very well trained people. Like everyone comes and says they're very
Right.
well trained. So my value proposition, which absolutely stood out for everyone, was like I will send them for a completely free 21-day evaluation. So they come to you for 21 days.
So, okay.
You
On
don't
the
pay.
job, on
Yeah,
the job,
yeah.
along with the team evaluation.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
So these are people in your office for 21 days working as your employees, pretty much. You pay zero for it. Now, that is a proposition that no one gives,
Gives.
right? Even though my product is significantly differentiated, all my customers will tell you that. But for my initial customers, they did not know my product was differentiated. But my value proposition was differentiated because I was giving them this 21-day free evaluation. Right. So
Excellent.
I'll encourage founders to think about how they can differentiate their value proposition in a very visible, tangible manner. So either
Excellent.
you can show very clearly there are features in your software product that other people do not have, or you find a way to give them something for them to try you. And then ultimately you as a salesperson, you can only make the customer try. After that, the product has to take over,
Right.
right? You can't sell ice to Eskimo multiple times. You can sell it once, right?
True.
Ice, yeah. So you can't sell it multiple times. So you sell it once, and hopefully then product then delivers on the promise.
Fantastic. That's excellent. I mean, that's a great insight as to sometimes how it's not actually the price, but it's your entire value proposition that can
In fact, I would say
withstand
founders.
the.
I sometimes kind of worry that sometimes founders think the race to winning an account is to by dropping the price. I don't think that's the right way at all. It's absolutely not the
Excellent.
right way at all. Yeah, you have to be firm on price. You have to focus on the product and be firm on price. And if you don't have a product that can actually justify the price, then you don't need to look at the price. You need to go and look at the product.
Right. So this is great. So how have you been able to scale, uh, your growth, to multi accounts, or if companies have got this in multiple cities, right? How have you been able to take that forward?
So initially, our deployments were only in Bangalore for almost 9 10 months. We didn't venture out of Bangalore at all,
Okay.
and it was also easy for us because Bangalore is really the biggest market for us in this country. Even right now, Bangalore is 70%, 60% of our sales. But I started getting demand from other cities, right? And initially I uh, kind of ignored it, but then it was very clear that there's enough demand outside, and I'd be stupid to not go and tap that demand. So, I mean, then of course, we then evolved value proposition for those places as well, and how there was some logistics involved because all our people get hired in Bangalore and then they have to travel. So we had to build all those things. There was some hit and trial. Uh, Sometimes we did not pay much. Sometimes we paid too much. So we got that right in about 6 months of hit and trial, but it wasn't. I mean, it clearly made our market much bigger. But from proposition point of view, it didn't take a lot to kind of get that proposition going.
Okay.
I think one thing that we are now doing, which probably is making the market even bigger, is that we are now doing remote deployments. So even before we used to get incoming interest from Bay Area companies and companies in Singapore, etc., asking people to deploy people remotely, asking us to deploy people remotely. But we didn't used to do it because we thought that if I have in-office deployment, why do I need to do a remote deployment, right? And because ultimately these are entry-level devs, right? Everything else being equal, they will work better in office than remotely, right?
Right.
But then because of the COVID situation, our bootcamp went remote, so now people became quite good at remote working. So then we kind of reached back to some of those people and said, hey, you know what? We're now going to do a trial, and I'm happy to deploy that. So we are now doing some of these trials, and they're going quite good. So we do hope that this will really kind of impact the market.
This will actually, create a very new large market for you.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? With this COVID and your ability to do remote deployment.
It can also significantly help us with pricing.
Right, right. Fantastic. So, off late, you have seen similar such companies come up, right? In under the new brand name called income sharing agreement type of companies. You got Presto, you got Lambda School, and so on and so forth. So, where do you see now, amongst the similar type of players, your positioning and value proposition, you see that continuing to remain the same to attract and acquire more customers, or do you see this to be slightly changing ahead?
So they of course have a different go-to market. So we think that our value proposition really is that a Zomato thinks that we will get great people from Konak. A Zomato thinks that we'll get great people from Mount Blue, or a Microsoft thinks that we'll get great people from Mount Blue. And hence they come to us. And hence people then want to work with Mount Blue because they know that the only way to Zomato with my resume is by Mount Blue. Right?
Okay.
So we haven't seen any dilution of this value proposition at all. And the market is really very big. So there's space for all of us to play.
Right.
Our value proposition is such that we have actually tried to build a very full stack approach to our customers, right? So it's like the Zomato CTO will call me and say, Konak, can you send me one great Python dev? And in a matter of weeks, one great Python dev literally turns up at their office in Gurgaon for a 21-day free evaluation. And he impresses them in the first 21 hours. And that's it. So we have a very, very easy interface to work with.
Okay.
Right? So which is why a Zomato wants to work with me. For the developer, it's a very easy interface. You are in a job. Think of it like Infosys. When you get hired by Infosys, Infosys sends you to Mysore for a boot camp. And then after you finish the boot camp, you get deployed at various customers, like a Deutsche Bank or a Barclays or a Telstra, right? Exactly that way, you get hired into Mount Blue. You come to Mount Blue's Bangalore boot camp for a 3-month boot camp. And after that, you'll be deployed to a Zomato or a Microsoft or a SoftSmart or a InstaMojo or a ClearTax, right? So it's a very easy to understand interface for the customer and a very easy to understand interface for the employee, right? So we quite like our go-to market. So, but I'm sure that there are other companies primarily taking the ISA approach to it, which are succeeding, and I wish them all the success. In fact, I think that we will actually benefit from them because there may be some people who they train well but are not able to find that high-paying a job, and we can actually hire them, and they almost come pre-trained to us. So we can, if they were very good, I could make them super ninja, right? So yeah, so we've actually been hiring some of these people. We've been hiring some of the people who have gone through these ISA boot camps.
Excellent. So during this evaluation period, and I'm going back to that point, just to link up something called as a sales experience and sales interaction experience, right? So you mentioned that you almost have this, frictionless 21-day period, and your deployed people impress in the first 21 hours. So what kind of customer interfacing, training do you encourage? Do you provide customer interaction training when people get deployed during this evaluation period? One, because these guys want to get that trial period closure done. There's like a product trial period, right? So you want the customer to have a great experience, but the product should also have the ability to deliver a great experience, right? So do you enable your candidates or your employees to undergo some sort of a customer experience workshops or sanitization on do's and don'ts when you're in that trial period?
We do 15 minutes of it. So
Okay.
we hardly
15
do
minutes.
anything. Yeah.
Okay.
So basically, look, I tell my customers that I'm not sending you a great interviewer. I'm sending you a great coder. If you want a great interviewer, I'm not the right place. Because you pay people not to interview well, but you pay people to code well. I'll
Right.
send you someone who will code fantastically, right? And if it's not evident in the first day, it will be evident in the first 21 days. If if you want people who interview great, I'm not the right way. I'm saying, do you want an interviewer or do you want a coder? If you want an interviewer, then I'll be preparing people for an interview. But you really want a coder, so I am preparing people only for coding, right? So
Got it.
give them work to do and they will deliver. And people who do not buy into this philosophy for us, they do not work well with us. So we have lost customers, and I'm very happy letting them go. Right? Because I'm not going to start wasting time in interview prep.
Fantastic.
Right? I want people get paid for coding, and people should learn coding.
Cool.
Right? It's a company's job to be able to decipher well who's a good coder. I help them by giving them a 21-day evaluation period. If you have a screwed up process of interviewing where you do not know how to find a good coder, well, I can't help you. I can only help you to the extent that I'll give you a 21-day evaluation. If you want my kid to impress you in the first 2 hours by giving some glib answers, I'm not the right person.
Got it.
Not every customer is the right customer for you, right?
Got it. So with your, with COVID and your remote, market being opened up right now, what's your plans to scale your team, your sales teams? Do you have some plans? Do you have some plans to streamline your, if you decide to hire up your sales teams, your tools, process, and those areas, can you talk a little bit on that?
Yeah, so we were actually just before this whole crisis hit, we were in the process of raising around. And so after that, we would have expanded on both sides. So I would have had to let go because now I run sales still and we have 150 plus customers. So it's becoming unsustainable for me to do that. So the idea was to kind of expand to kind of bolster both on the delivery side and both the demand side and the supply side. So we would have bolstered it, but right now, of course, plans have been put on hold a little bit. We will still come back to this in about 6 months' time.
Okay.
But we will grow. We will ultimately get a head of sales, and yeah, but we are probably about a couple of quarters away from it right now.
Got
At
it.
least one quarter away from it right now, I think.
Fantastic. Last
Then
question from my side.
and then when we get the sales person going, then what processes we'll build and we'll see then. I don't know right now.
Right. Got it. Great. Last question from my side before we jump on to questions from the audience. So, so during this COVID time, how did your team transition? How did your team and your customer transition with your service delivery of
So
of everyone moving remote? Did you see a
so
drop in on your employee productivity, which had certain requirement for the customers to renegotiate your contract and stuff like that, or pretty much day goes on?
no, so I mean, when a developer goes and starts working for the customer, then for all practical purposes, the customer treats them like their own employee, right? So everyone kind of went off remote based on the customer's SOP, right? So Microsoft has a very different, elaborate SOP versus a smaller company which will have a much different SOP. But yeah, everyone went remote, and I don't think our people had any more loss of productivity than the general population. So we haven't. I don't think I've heard any complaint about people becoming much less
Okay.
productive after this happened. Yeah, I've heard complaints about everyone becoming much less productive after this happened. So, people have not been able to single out our people.
Got it.
Of course, our boot camp went remote, about 70 odd days back, about a week before, about 10 days before the government announced the lockdown. So initially, of course, it was very haphazard because some people want to go home and then people are not accustomed to working from home. And a lot of my developers actually live in PGs. So I and you have homes. They really don't have homes. They are essentially PGs,
Right.
nothing but a bed, but really a bed, right? So, and with a table thrown in sometimes. So it
Right.
was, of course, tough, but we were very supportive. In fact, there are people who had mental issues as well, health issues as well, and we've helped out with money and otherwise. Um, um, in fact, I would say that we would have actually paid more money in COVID than we were paying earlier to some people,
Okay.
because people got into health issues, sometimes mental health issues, physical health issues,
Got
uh,
it.
you know, issues with PGs, and we also have a bunch of women devs. So their safety in a way is also one of our top concerns, right? So,
Got it.
so it was happening for the first 15, 20 days, but I think people then settled in
Right.
and people are doing really well. And now I think we are at a distinct advantage because, we compete with campus hiring in a way, right?
Okay.
So now
Yes.
Zomato can, I mean, not that Zomato is hiring right now, they just fired a bunch of people, but for someone to go and hire from an IIT or from a triple IT or an IIT, they would get someone who would not have worked remote at all.
Right.
Versus if they hire from us, you get people who've been working remote for 3 months, right? So, and they've kind of really done well in that time. So we
Right.
feel that our developers, so we actually feel that this will actually be a big tailwind for us. So we feel that our customers are going to come back very fast and they're going to demand more. In fact, in the last 3 days, I've had more inquiries than I've had in the last 1 month. Just
Okay.
almost about the time when lockdown really lifted in Bangalore. Really, from this Monday only, everything has
Correct.
been much more as usual.
Right.
So this week, after Monday, Tuesday, maybe people were still sussing out things and getting back to office. Wednesday onwards, people have been calling me with a vengeance. In fact, while on this call, I've gotten 2 calls that I've not been able to take.
Sure.
Uh,
Wonderful. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Konark. Great insights. Moving on to questions from the audience. Naveen has a question.
Yeah, hi. Hey, I think Kona, good, very good in terms of very straightforward answers, and I love the way you guys have gone and built uh, in terms of the company and everything. I do a similar work in the sports field. We also provide analysts to many sports companies. The problem I find is twofold. Uh, the people who come there is to work in a sports company or like ISL, Pro Kabaddi, IPL, and those kind of companies around. And one is that on the scalability in terms of how can you scale? People want to join them back instead of working for uh, analytics company than working for a team. Second is how do you make sure the delivery is being provided what is being expected out of them. We can't have a similar kind of knowledge and the expertise which can vary. So clients have been happy, but I want to see there could be people joining them back. You know, so and how do you take care of that?
so we try to take a very aligning all interests approach to all these problems. So
Hmm.
our approach to this is that the developers are actually on our roles for a period of 15 months. So that's decided. The first 3 months is their boot camp with us, and the
Hmm.
following 12 months is their deployment with the customer. After the
Okay.
15 months is over, mandatorily they're off our roles, right? So
Okay.
think about that developer. So then they have to find another job after that, and the best
Hmm.
place for them to find a job is a company they've been working in, right? So they have all the incentive to do really well in that company, so that this company makes them an offer at the end of 15 months, right?
Yeah.
So we pay our developers 3.6 lakh rupees a year. Our salaries open on our website, and we have
Hmm.
had people finish their 12 months with a customer and go on salary as high as 25 lakh rupees a year,
Hmm.
right?
Okay.
So the developer is very simple. You do well here, you will get a great offer from here, and whether you accept that offer or not is a secondary issue. But at least get a great offer. It'll help you negotiate elsewhere. It's another thing altogether, though, that 90% plus of our developers actually end up working in the particular company we deployed them at. Because those companies, at the end of 12 months, they really like them and they make them really good offers. Right? And the
So you wouldn't lose the customer there, but you would have more people working for them.
and they come back and ask you more. Look, the thing is, Naveen, a good developer will never want to be on my role for a very long time, right? Because ultimately they want to work for Zomato, they want to work for ClearTax, they want to work for Microsoft, right?
Correct.
It's very clear to them that I am their channel to get into Microsoft, right?
Yes.
And so unless and until and I should also behave like that. If I start to think about hoarding them, right? Unless I align my objectives with them, they're not going to perform. The only way they are going to perform is when they know that Mount Blue has their best interest at heart, and that what if by what Mount Blue says, if we do that, we have the best possible outcome of our career. And that's exactly my 15-minute call that I was telling Bimlesh, which I'm going to do tomorrow for 15 people. Is that guys go there, kick ass, 12 months later, work out the 10 lakh rupee per annum job. Right? I want you to do well, go and do well, work out the 10 lakh rupee per annum job. It's your choice whether to take it or not, but work out with a 10 lakh rupee per annum job. So there is no scope of dissonance here at all. They know that Mount Blue is rooting for them to succeed. Right? So it's very important for us to, for us to align the objectives, because there is no way in knowledge economy that you can force people to work and deliver.
Yeah.
Right? Hours are immaterial. You could work 12 hours, deliver nothing. You could work 2 hours, deliver the world, right? So hours are immaterial. You have to find a way to align objectives. So, I mean, I don't exactly know what sports KPI does, but I mean, from a scalability point of view, of course, I think the underlying market is very important. I mean, right? So that's why we chose software engineers. It's a very, very large and growing market.
Correct.
Right?
Correct.
So a lot of people come and tell us, why don't you do this also and that also, but we stick to software. So it's very important. Ultimately, when founders and markets collide, markets always win. Markets will never lose. You pick a bad market, you could be the biggest ninja, you will lose. And you find a good market, you could be a mediocre founder, you will still make enough money. And that's why I really believe. That's what I really believe. Right? So I think it's important to find a large, growing underlying market.
Yeah, correct. All right. Thanks, Kunal.
Fantastic. Thanks, Naveen. From Smita Mishra.
Hi, Kunal. Hi, Bimlesh. Thank you for the great session. My question here is that sometimes when you are trying to offer your services to the customers, you're going from one customer to another in the very initial stage, and you have a set of services that you wish to offer. But the problem that you're trying to address now, the problem may be different for different customers. For example, your Zomato may be facing shortage of one particular kind of resource, whereas your ex client may be having some other issue with resources. So while your service is the same, you offer talented skill or kind of skilled labor in certain area. Now, so when you offer it different customers, do you go there and try to repackage not the core of the service, but on the surface of it? Do you try to package your services differently to different customers, also giving them an opportunity to say that, okay, we will also do this little customization here for you, something to that you just to be able to get the deal, or do did you have to do that? More important.
No, I think absolutely. I think you've got to do it at the start, especially because when the initial few customer conversations are a process of finding the right proposition as well, right? So we can't be arrogant to think that whatever came to our mind as the first value proposition is the very proposition we'll work with. So, for example, in our case, we first started off with not giving a trial period at all, and then started off with giving a 1 week trial period, made it 2 weeks, and then made it 3 weeks. So definitely, I think you'll need to kind of do slightly different messaging, slightly different packaging, but we have to be conscious of not completely changing what we're trying to do. Now, you could change that and you could go into a good direction as well, right? But the founder has to feel good about it. The founder has to feel that I'm going in the right direction. If you intuitively feel that you are being pulled into a wrong direction, right, then you need to, I think, find a way to avoid those conversations and go to other customers who will listen to what you are saying and want to work with that. And if you do that enough and still don't find enough customers, then maybe what you are doing is wrong, and then you need to think of other things, right? But we can't let customers pull us in various different directions, because that's a short recipe for not being able to deliver well and then having angry customers anyway, right? You would rather under promise and over deliver than over promise and under deliver, always.
Thanks, Kanan.
I don't know if I answered the question. If there's a specific, I mean, I'm happy to also chat one-on-one. If there's a specific kind of instance you want to talk about, I can probably provide a much deeper insight. But yeah,
I think we had one last question coming in from Naresh. His question was, how do you believe that this model works? There are so many companies out there. So I think you kind of answered this question. Initially, I think your value proposition is the what, which is standing out with ready developers being out there. I think nothing beats that. I've been on the other side where I've been looking to hire talent, and this definitely.
the only one thing I want to say here is a very general, almost a smart-ass comment, is that look, first to market is nothing, right? First to market, there's no early mover advantage in most businesses. There is an advantage to the first to product market fit, right? So there can be a lot of companies, and I'm sure we all know Google was not the first search engine and Facebook was not the first social media platform. We all know those stories, right? So I think it's the first to product market fit, or if you can get a good lock on product market fit. The fact that there are so many companies out there only shows that there is a real problem to be solved, right? And that there's probably a big market. That there are a lot of people playing in this market is not necessarily a deterrent. In fact, I would say that's a check mark. What should deter you is if there are people who already have a big lock here, right? And that they're winning big time. And that they exactly understand what the customer needs, and every customer is happy with them. A market with a lot of customers, a lot of providers, and no one being happy is the best market for you to go in and make people happy. Right? So you will hardly find, so you say there are a lot of people out there, but you will hardly find companies saying we are really happy with our vendor.
Correct.
Right? You will probably very rarely find it. They are always sending us bad people, they overcharge us, there is no professionalism, right? This is what we normally hear. What does it mean? Those companies, if they hear from a friend that, you know what, talk to Konak, Mount Blue is really good, they will give you a chance. And then once Mount Blue gets a chance and Mount Blue delivers, then you have that customer for life.
Yeah, fantastic. This is awesome, Konak. I think a lot of insights from a very different perspective. I like the hacks of how you leverage your network. The whole brochure thing of keeping something out on customer's table, and the strong focus on value proposition becoming the way to drive differentiation and have a stronger pricing strategy, and your new ability to go remote with a strong sales interaction experience for your people. These have been some of my takeaways. Thank you so much, Konak, once again for joining PitchCamp Sales for Entrepreneur series. I would like to thank all the audience who joined in. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you all.